Hey everybody, thanks for joining White Dog Outdoors and part 2 of our fly selection mini-series. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, I recommend you start there because we covered some really good stuff. I'll leave a link to that video down in the description. And if you haven't seen our Nymphing series, that is a great resource for anyone wanting to learn Nymphing. Before we get rolling in today's video, we have a couple of big announcements. This channel has been growing really well. We're closing in on 20,000 subscribers right now, and before too long, we're going to be hitting 25,000 subscribers. I wanted to give back in a big way, so we are announcing that we're going to be doing several giveaways when we hit 25,000 subscribers. The big announcement is that we're partnering with Diamondback Fly Rods, and we're going to be giving away a Diamondback Ideal Nymph Nymphing fly rod. We haven't decided exactly which one it's going to be yet, but I am so excited for that relationship and for what we're going to be doing to give back to our community. Plus, I have a few other giveaways that we're going to do along when we hit that as well. One of them, which looks like it's going to be valued at about $175, is going to be for White Dog Pack members only. So, you know, these are the people who've invested in us. Thank you, all the pack members. I really appreciate it. I want to give back to you guys as well. So we're going to do one giveaway specifically for the White Dog Pack. If you want to join the pack, if you want to support what we're doing, I'll leave a link down below in the description to that as well. And one last thing really quickly is since we launched part 1 of the fly selection mini-series, we have not been able to keep our hand-tied flies in stock. They have been flying off the shelves as soon as we can tie them. So I'm working on getting a little more help in tying those flies, and we're updating inventory almost nightly, so check back often if you're interested in buying flies. All right, that's all the announcements for now, so let's get into part 2 of the fly selection mini-series. All right, so let's talk about sink rates. So how quickly is my fly going to penetrate down through the water and get down toward the bottom of the water column? And if you haven't watched the Nymphing series, you might not really realize why it's important to get down to the bottom of the water column. So I'd recommend, again, go check out the Nymphing series, understand the basics of everything there, and you'll understand why we want to get our flies down near the bottom. But in terms of sink rate, how quickly is my fly going to drop down to the bottom? What's important? What's going to be the leading factors that are going to help my fly get down toward the bottom? Okay, so we've talked about weight, but weight is not the only thing that matters when we're talking about sink rates. In fact, if we go and have a little science lesson, if we talk about, if we were to take a feather and a bowling ball and put them in a vacuum where there's no air, there's no outside forces on those items, the feather is going to fall at the same rate as the bowling ball. What the difference is there's friction, right? The air that's in our world, we don't live in a vacuum, we live in the world, and the air that's in the world counteracts the forces. So a heavy bowling ball is got more mass to it. It's going to sink. It's going to counteract that friction that's against it. The friction of the air is going to be nothing for a bowling ball compared to the friction that's against a really lightweight feather, right? So in a vacuum, they're both going to drop at the same time. In the real world, in the air, the bowling ball is going to go smash into the ground, the feather is going to float nice and soft down, right? It's the friction of the air that's causing it to float slowly down to the bottom. Well, water is the same, except water is going to create more friction, right? So what becomes important now? The weight, the mass of the fly is important because that's what's going to counteract the forces of friction as it's trying to sink, right? So a small profile fly, and this is where we get into profile, a small profile fly that has a smaller weight but a more compact weight is going to sink down through the water fairly quickly, whereas a large fly, like let's say our squirmy worm, it's got these tentacles hanging off, even though it's a heavier fly, it actually is going to create more friction as it tries to sink down through the water because it's got a bigger profile. Okay, so weight is important to getting your fly down because it's going to counteract that friction as it's going down, the resistance in the water. And profile is important because the more surface area it has, the harder it's going to, the more friction is going to be against it as it tries to sink. Okay, so those are two really important factors when we're talking about sink rate. So let's do a little science experiment and see what these things actually look like. All right, so we're going to start with air as our friction. You guys aren't going to be able to see this, but you'll be able to get the picture, right? I have a really tiny, I have the 200 milligram zebra paragon in my left hand and I have a pink squirmy in my right hand. And this pink squirmy is probably about 4 times the weight as the Paragon, but it's got a bigger profile. Now I don't have a whole lot of resistance because it's just air, right? So when I drop them, they hit the ground at the exactly same time. But let's drop them in some water and see what the difference really is. Now granted, I only have a very small distance that I can drop these through the water because I don't really have a bigger container than that. But in about 14 inches of water, let's see how quickly or how slowly they drop. All right, so we saw that a smaller profile fly that was about 1/4 of the actual weight actually sank about twice as fast as a bigger profile fly that was 4 times the weight, right? Because of the resistance in the water, that squirmy fell at about half the rate of the Paragon. So what kept that squirmy from falling so fast was the resistance in the water, right? So now we've seen how quickly things can get to the bottom. But what's really important when you're Euro-nymphing, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, is sight versus feel. But in terms of feeling the flies and feeling what's going on, a lot of Euro-nymphing for me specifically has a lot to do with feel. And there's a lot of people, we're going to get into this, but a lot of people are saying it should be more sight than feel. Bottom line, it's a combination of the two. We'll get there, but feel is really important. And so let's say I have a Paragon on and it gets down easily, but it had very little resistance to get down into the water, and it's only 200 milligrams. So what happens when I try to feel that nymph? It's so light, it's going to be hard to feel, and there's so little resistance in the water that it's going to pull right back up through the water column. It's going to be really hard to feel something as small as a Paragon. Now, if I'm using a big old squirmy here, it's 4 times the weight, and there's a ton of resistance. So once that fly gets down to the bottom, I'm really going to feel it. I'm going to feel a lot of weight on that fly, and I'm going to feel anything that happens with that fly. Okay, so a bigger profile fly would take longer to get down, but I'm going to have a lot of feel with it, right? That resistance against the water is going to put some tension on my line, and I'm really going to be able to feel it. Okay, so we've talked about the weight of the flies, we've talked about the profile of the flies and how that's going to affect how we're going to feel things. So we've talked about the fact that the drift, getting the good drift is the most important piece when fly fishing, and more important than the fly itself is getting the right drift. So understanding the weight of the fly and the profile of the fly and how that's going to affect our drift is going to be really important. So what happens if I have too much weight in my flies? If I have too much weight in my flies, maybe I'm in low water conditions or I'm just in shallow water conditions, I'm going to be hanging bottom a lot. When I have heavy flies, I'm going to be hanging bottom a lot. And so in order to keep from hanging bottom, I'm constantly going to be pulling those flies and keeping a tight line to keep it off bottom. When I do that, I'm going to be pulling those flies toward me. So I'm not going to be getting a natural drift. And unless I'm throwing a jig streamer where I want that to be the case, I'm going to be affecting the drift in a negative way, right? If I want a natural drift, I need to make sure that I'm not putting too much tension on those flies to be able to pull them toward me. Okay, on the other hand, if I'm fishing, if my flies are too light, what's going to happen? Well, number one, either I'm not going to get down through the faster water into the slower water below, and I'm not going to be in the area or the strike zone of those fish where those fish are looking for their food, and I'm not going to be able to feel anything. If my flies are too light for the water conditions, I'm just simply not going to be able to feel anything, and my only chance of feeling something is if a fish comes up and grabs it and starts swimming away, which isn't very often that that's going to happen, right? So too heavy, too light, the good fisherman out there is really going to figure out what combination of flies makes sense to be able to get the right drift for the particular water conditions, and that is going to change from run to pool to run to pool to riffle, whatever you're fishing. It's going to change constantly. Okay, that I think is going to be the biggest key for people, is starting to break down that water, understanding what the right feel is, and what things should look like as you're out there fishing, to make sure that you're using the right weight combinations to be able to get into the strike zones in the right places. All right, so let's break that down a little bit further. There is almost this contentious feeling between Euro-nymphers of people who say that you should be seeing more of your takes, or people saying you should feel more of your takes. And I've had a lot of people, actually, because I've said in my own videos that I feel about 90% of the takes that I have from fish. And I have people comment and say that, well, you're missing a lot of fish. But I will tell you, anybody who thinks that it's one way versus another 100% of the time is not very high up in my book. I will 100%, there's one thing that's 100% in fly fishing, and that it's a combination of both sight and feel. All right, let's just do the basics of when you're gonna feel a strike versus when you're gonna see a strike more than the other, okay? If I'm fishing closer to me, I'm gonna be fishing more underneath my rod tip, and I'm gonna have less line for me to be able to see. There's not gonna be as much of a bow in my line. I'm probably gonna be keeping a slightly tighter line on those flies than I would if they were further away. So if I'm fishing closer to me, I'm probably gonna rely more on feel than I am on sight. If I'm fishing further away from me, I'm going to have more line out. I'm going to have a much lower angle. And so I'm going to be able to see more of what's going on in my line. And I'm not going to want to keep a tight line on those flies as much because I'm going to be affecting my drift and pulling them toward me. So when I'm fishing further away from me, I'm typically going to rely a little more on sight than I do on feel. If I'm in a situation that calls for using heavier flies, I am more likely going to have a tighter line because I've got heavier flies. I'm keeping a tighter line so I don't get hung up on the bottom. And I'm more likely going to be using feel in that particular situation. The tighter the line is, the less you're going to see your line moving, and you're going to rely more on feel than sight. Again, combination of the two, but more on feel than sight when I'm using heavier flies. If I'm in situations where I'm using lighter flies, that's a situation where I'm not going to be able to keep as tight a line on those flies, and so there's going to be more play in the leader, and that's really key, is watching that leader and getting that ability to see the currents taking and seeing anything that might be different that gives you an idea that you need to set the hook. Further away, I'm probably going to rely more on sight than I am on feel. All right, so let's put ourselves in different situations on the water and then figure out, hey, what types of flies might be best in those types of situations, okay? And this is what I think, this is a critical piece. Making sure that you're putting on the right types of flies in the right types of situations to be able to get that right drift is gonna be really important. So let's start with like high water conditions, okay? If I'm fishing high water conditions, there's a couple of things I'm gonna look for. Number one, learn how to break down water and learn how to find the slowest water and the deepest water in those particular sections. That's going to be important. I do have a few videos on that. But selecting the right flies in those types of conditions is going to be important. Okay, in faster, bigger water conditions, maybe I have more depth, maybe I have faster water, the water levels have come up. I'm typically going to use a heavier fly. So this is an area where I'm putting a sexy stonefly bomb on my point fly. And depending on the depth, depending on how fast that water is moving or the areas I'm trying to get my flies into, anytime I'm in water that has come up recently, I'm going to put a squirmy worm on. That's a great time to put a squirmy worm on. What happens when water flows up? It washes things into the river. What's one of the common things that's going to wash into the river is worms, right? So my big combination for big water or fast water conditions are a sexy stonefly bomb on my point and a pink squirmy or a tan squirmy on the dropper. This has gotten me so many big fish in fast water conditions. I think that's probably some of my most favorite conditions to fish in. Is just, it doesn't need to be big water. I don't mean big water, but just fast and high water conditions. Finding those slow seams and getting your flies down and penetrating down in and keeping a tight line. This is an area where I am definitely going to be feeling things more than seeing things, because I'm going to be penetrating that water. I'm going to be keeping a tight line and trying to keep my flies down within a particular area. Okay, so high water conditions, I love heavy flies for those particular conditions. If there's any color to the water, like I ran into some runoff conditions in March of last year or so. But anytime there's like runoff conditions where the water's getting a little murky, or you've had a rain, the water's getting a little murky, I will go with either really dark flies or really bright flies. And so like maybe a black sexy stonefly, it's going to cause some contrast in colors, and then a pink squirmy. The pink really stands out in those types of conditions. And I've gotten some really, really nice fish on those pink squirmies in those high off-water color conditions. I mean, I've caught fish in off-color conditions where When I drop my fly down a foot, that fly is gone from view, but that pink squirmy comes through for me sometimes in that situation. So big flies, really dark flies, really colorful flies are going to help fish see and help you get into the right areas and help fish see the flies. All right, when I'm fishing pocket water is so interesting and fun to fish because there are 100 opportunities in front of you at any given point in time. There is, a pocket here, there's an eddy here, there's a seam here, there's this side of the seam, there might be a seam further across that I can't get to. There's so many opportunities. It's like anybody who loves to break down water and find fish, it's like their absolute dream is finding fish in pocket water because it's just so interesting and interesting to fish. I think a lot of it comes down to how close you're fishing to you, how high that water is. Anything that's a little bit higher water, or a lot of times those pockets are going to be pretty deep. So a lot of times I want to use heavier flies in pocket water, and a lot of times there's a lot of turbidity to that water because there's a lot of falls, a lot of plunging pools and stuff like that, and it's harder for the fish to see. So a lot of times I'm going to use bigger flies. I'm going to use heavier flies, and I'm going to use flies with some sort of color to them. So either like a pink squirmy, or maybe a sexy stone with some really bright colored legs, or other flies with hot spots on them. I have absolutely found that in pocket water, using something that's going to help them see the fly is really important. I have fished, a certain run with very natural looking flies in pocket water and gotten absolutely nothing, and then I put on a fly with a hot spot and first cast to catch a fish. So I think making sure that you're able to get that right drift, and a lot of time that does mean heavy flies, and then giving them a fly that they can see. So something with color, something that's bigger maybe, something with legs, something that's going to be able to really help them see and key in on that fly. All right, so the next situation is maybe more of a summertime pattern. I've got maybe lower water conditions, I've got clearer water, and I've got lower water. Number one, what's that gonna mean? It means the fish are gonna be spookier. I'm not gonna be able to be as close to those fish as I would in higher water conditions. They're gonna see me or they're gonna hear me coming a lot easier. That means I'm gonna fish further away from me, right? If I'm not, I'm gonna spook those fish. Okay, that typically also means in lower water conditions, I'm going to use some smaller fly combinations. And I'm probably going to use more natural colors. They have a little more time to inspect the fly. There's not as much color to the water. The visibility is really good. I probably want to give them something that's natural looking. Okay, so a lot of times I'm going to start with maybe a standard fly for my point fly, and maybe I'm going to use a Paragon on the dropper. Those are a lot of times my go-to for summertime, clear water, low water conditions. I'm going to use lighter flies. I'm going to fish further away from me, and I am definitely going to rely more on my sighter moving to detect those strikes than I am on feel. In those light conditions, if I'm using light flies in shallow water, I'm going to be pulling those flies too much. I'm going to cast them out, I'm going to give it some slack, and I'm going to watch that leader. If I see the bend in the leader move, if I see anything jump, that's my indication. So summertime fishing tends to be more sight than feel for me. All right, so we have a ton of information now on how to be able to select the right flies, how we're going to potentially fish those flies in the different types of situations. And now what happens if I'm not getting the action that I want in those things? Well, let's first of all make sure that we're getting our flies in the right places, right? So am I ticking bottom at all? Typically I don't want to be ticking bottom all the time. I want to tick bottom once in a while. If I'm not ticking bottom at all, I might not be getting down far enough. If I'm ticking bottom and getting hung up too much, I'm probably getting down too much and I need to go a little bit lighter. So I think throughout the day, the good fisherman is going to pay attention to what's going on, and they're going to be able to make the adjustments. Do I need to go lighter? Do I need to go heavier? There was a day on the Au Sable, the water looked up. I thought I needed to be really heavy. I put on my heavy set of flies, and I kept hanging bottom. And I tell you what, in big, bouldery pocket water, when you get hung up, you're not going to get it out. I lost so many flies, and then I was like, okay, I need to adjust. And I adjusted the weight of my flies and went much lighter, and I started to connect with fish immediately. So pay attention. Am I getting too deep? Am I not getting deep enough? Number one, am I getting the right drift? That's number one. Okay, so make adjustments to try to get that right drift. Okay. Number two, if I feel like I'm getting the right drift, I feel like I'm getting in the right places, my flies are slowing down in the good places and I'm just not getting takes. You know, we say that getting the right drift is more important than the fly, but there are days where the fly absolutely matters. I've certainly had a number of those types of days. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was out with one of my guides and we were fishing a particular run. I had thrown a sexy stone through the run probably a dozen times, and we both looked at each other and said, we need to throw on a pink squirmy. I threw on a pink squirmy, and the first drift through, I nailed a 20-inch fat bow. That fish looked at my sexy stonefly probably 5 times and said, no, I'm not going to take it. But as soon as he saw that pink squirmy, he was on it like that, and it was deep in his mouth. He ate that thing so hard. And so, you know, fly does matter sometimes. Again, drift is more important than fly, but fly absolutely does matter. If you're fishing areas that you think are good, if you think you're getting the right drifts, but you're not getting the takes, start changing up your flies. Start trying something different. Try going more realistic if you've got too much color. If you're using realistic flies, try something with a hot spot. Try something with a different profile fly. And then you'll start to learn a lot of times what flies work in your different rivers a little bit better. I certainly have rivers where I have go-to patterns for those particular rivers. So when it comes to Euro nymphing, I tie all of my own flies, and there are a few reasons for it. I talked about a little bit of this already, but ultimately it comes down to control. I want to be able to control everything that has to do with my fishing. And if I am trying to buy flies online, number one, I don't know how big they are necessarily. I don't know how heavy they are necessarily. I don't know how they're going to feel when I fish. For me, as a fly tyer and fisherman, I want to tie my own flies so I can control my experience as much as possible. And that comes from just being out on the water and seeing different types of situations and then coming back and be like, all right, that didn't work exactly like I wanted. I want to adjust this. I'm going to do this, right? And so, number one, I want to be able to control and adapt everything that I'm doing exactly as I want to be successful. Okay, that's number one reason I tie. Number two is I feel like it's impossible to find, it's not impossible, it's hard to find good flies specifically for Euro nymphing. Typically they're not heavy enough for me. And so I think one of the main struggles that I mentioned before is just not having an understanding of how heavy those flies really are. Again, size does not necessarily equal weight or sink rate or anything like that. And so I want to have complete control over my flies. And so, like you'll see on my website where I sell the flies, I'm going to tell you what size beads I use, I'm going to tell you how much lead is in them, and I'm going to tell you the weight of those flies. Okay, simply, you're going to be able to know the specifics. I think more people need to do that, honestly, in order to help people be successful on the more advanced level. The third reason I tie my own flies is that, again, it has to do with control. Is I want to be able to go out, see the bug life that lives in my waters, and be able to imitate that as closely as possible. I want to be able to adjust and adapt as necessary, and if I tie my own flies, I can do exactly what I want to do. Having said that, I do think basic patterns are all most people need. I think fly patterns are probably more for the fly tyer than they are the actual fish. I think a lot of the basic fly patterns that are out there are incredibly successful in a lot of situations. So you don't need to go crazy. You can stick with some basic stuff. Fill your fly box with, like we talked about, a variety of sizes, weights, profiles, colors. It's going to help you cover the bases, honestly. But I do want to have that complete control, and so that's another reason I tie my own flies. So if you want to tie your own flies, I have all of the patterns that I have in this box and more. They're on my YouTube channel. I'll link the playlist to the fly tying series down below. If you want to go and tie all those flies yourself, that's what it's there for. Go have fun and adapt as necessary for your waters. If you would rather buy your flies than tie your flies, I do have everything on our website now in our online shop. I'll link that down below too. Again, you'll be able to understand all the specific details of the flies, more so than other places that you're going to find them out there. If you want to tie your own flies, one of the things that gets a little confusing is that the bead sizes are measured in two different standards. They're measured in inches and they're measured in millimeters, and different manufacturers will list them one way versus another. And so when you're looking at a fly pattern that you want to tie, a lot of times you'll be like, well, what's a 3.2 millimeter in inches? And you're trying to figure that stuff out. That was something that was a little bit complicated. So I put together a little chart. This chart is a generalization. Every bead manufacturer may be slightly different than another, but this is a generalization of inches to millimeters, so that when you're looking at a fly tying pattern, you can figure out, if they list it in millimeters, but all you have is yours listed in inches, here's the comparable bead to that. All right, I lied to you guys. I don't know how you can trust me anymore, but this is not going to be a two-part mini-series on fly selection. It's turning into a three-part mini-series on fly selection. So this video is getting a little bit long. I didn't want to jam too much into one video, so we're going to take the last part of the video, a really important part, the question that I get asked the most, and we're going to put it into part 3, and that's going to be what's in my fly box. I'm going to take you guys through all the flies that I use on a regular basis. I'm going to show you the basics of how they're tied, like what kind of beads they are, how heavy they are, and what situations I use them in. And so that is going to be coming a week from the launch of this video. Everything's recorded, it's all set to go. So that's going to be coming in 1 week. In addition to that, we have more to come throughout the year. We're going to be breaking down a few sections of water, so we're going to do a couple of videos on that. We're going to take a section of water, we're going to analyze it and figure out where we think we should fish, and we're going to go and attack that water and see where we can be successful. And we're going to talk about how certain areas became successful and maybe others did not. So it's all learning how to read water, and it's one of the most important things you could do. Plus, we're going to be doing a Nymphing for steelhead video, which I'm super excited about. I'm going to be using my 10-foot 10-inch Diamondback Ideal Nymph for that bad boy. Cannot wait. And cannot wait to get that rod bent on some steelhead. Super excited about the relationship with Diamondback and what we're going to be doing. And speaking of Diamondback, when we hit 25,000 subscribers, we're going to be doing a really big giveaway. We're going to be giving away a Diamondback Ideal Nymph fly rod. Super excited for that. Plus, there's going to be other giveaways along with that. So if you're not subscribed, definitely subscribe so you can know when that's going to happen. And hey, you guys are awesome. We will see you next week for part 3 of the fly selection mini-series.